Hello, and welcome to our webinar on navigating the philanthropic landscape. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll take you through the Giving USA 2015 data, which was just released, and we'll share with you some of our thoughts on the philanthropic landscape. I'm Ed Sevilla, Senior Vice President of Grenzebach Lear & Associates, and here at the firm I lead the Strategic Communications practice.
And my name is Scott Lange. I'm Vice President of Analytics at Grenzebach Lear & Associates, and had the privilege from 2006 to 2012 to serve on the Giving USA Editorial Review Board. So I have some historic perspective on what we'll be reviewing today.
First, let's give you a little bit of background on the Giving USA 2016 report. This is the longest running publication on charitable giving in the U.S. It's published by the Giving USA Foundation, and the research and writing was conducted by Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Our role at GG+A is that we're a member of the Giving Institute and the Editorial Review Board, as well as a sponsor of the report. So Scott, how about kicking things off with a high-level overview?
Absolutely. When you look at the 2015 contributions by source, the first item that comes to your attention is that total giving reached its highest level ever at $373.25 billion. Now, what's interesting about this pie chart is that 71% of that came from individuals, 16% from foundations, 9% from bequests, and 5% from corporations. Now, I want you to please note that these sources are defined as recognized by the IRS. In other words, foundations includes the nuance of family foundations, community foundations, and corporate foundations, and recognize as well that bequests are from individuals who have since passed away but remembered charitable institutions in their estate plans. And when considering trends over time, which we'll see later, there's been a growth in family foundations, and recognize that corporate giving typically represents 5% of the total. Changing now to who receives that benevolence, religion tops the chart at 32% of the total. Education is in second place at 15%. Human services in third this year at 12%. And gifts to foundation rounds the turn at fourth at 11%. Gifts to health round out the fifth spot at 8% of the total contributions received. Now, I'd like to add that religion has always been the predominant recipient of philanthropy in the U.S., typically followed by education, health, or human services battling for the second, third, and fourth slots. And I also want to express that sometimes gifts for purposes associated with health might be directed to an academic institution, i.e. a medical center, or a hospital or healthcare system, or a foundation that might serve to sponsor research in a particular area like heart or cancer. But in any event, the sum total is that this all relates to people helping other people. Ed, could you take a look at our trend in giving over time?
Sure, absolutely. So when you look at the total giving over the last, since 75 to 2015, the $373.25 billion in 2015 in total giving represents a 4.1% increase over 2014. So that increase comes to a total of $14.65 billion. That trend line over time is up. Since 1975, in fact, only 3 years saw a decline in giving. Those years were 1987, 2008, and 2009 during recessions. And this year in 2015, giving by foundations and corporations matched or exceeded their previous inflation-adjusted highs. And so there's lots of good news in this northward trend. You see, of course, in the red there, those are the years 2008, 2009 where we experienced the economic downturn. And in fact, in 2009, for the first time in history, charitable giving went down during a recession. That depth of that recession was significant enough that total philanthropy decreased. That was such a recovery. That recovery was such a hard one to come out of. I think we can all remember how hard our work was then to recover, but the recovery was certainly there. And we wanted to show you that by identifying for you the years between 2000 and 2015, 2005 and 2015. So here we've isolated those 10 years. The blue bars are inflation-adjusted dollars for total giving in that year. And you see in those brown bars, those are inflation-adjusted dollars in the recession years 2007 to 2009, and you can see that significant downward trend. Now, when we were all talking a year ago with the 2014 data, the big news then was that giving had returned. It was back to its pre-recession level. And still more good news this year that $373.25 billion represents another increase. It's a 4.1% increase over 2014, as we said. That's that $14.65 billion increase. And what we'd like to do today is tell you a little bit more, take that apart for you a little bit more. What drives that increase, and what might you think about as you see that level of increase. So let's first go to three specific sectors. We'll talk about education, healthcare, and arts and culture. And we'll start here with education, which you see by the numbers. Just to remind folks, 15% of total giving went to education. That total comes to $57.48 billion you see in the upper right-hand corner of this chart. That increase is an increase of 8.9% over 2014. And of those dollars, 70% went to higher education. The rest going, of course, to K through 12, vocational, and technical schools. This total for education given in 2015 hit its highest inflation-adjusted level ever. So very good news for the education sector. And that was driven by several $100 million plus gifts, which boosted education giving. Quite notably, there was a $400 million gift to Harvard, a $300 million in-kind rare books and manuscripts gift to Princeton. And so just to plant a seed for our ongoing conversation, the primary driver of these gifts was of this growth was gifts of $100 million or more. Scott, what about the health sector? Do you want to turn to that?
Well, again, 8% of all donations received by charities in 2015 was directed toward the healthcare sector. That represented $29.81 billion. That was an increase of 1.3% over 2014 and a 6.7% over 2013, over a two-year period of time. Many healthcare charities launched campaigns in 2015, as described by the nonprofit Research Collaborative. 25% of those respondents indicated that they were in a campaign. So what I want to point out here is that although the rate of increase decreased to 1.3%, it was still more than the previous year. And I also want to point out again that some gifts to health are actually recorded as gifts to education because they went to academic medical centers. And also to reinforce the point that some human service sector gifts are also associated with health. So the slight year-over-year increase may in some respect be due to the definition of the recipient receiving those gifts. And I'd like to highlight the fact that here, too, there were some significant $100 million plus gifts. Mr. David H. Koch actually made a gift of $150 million to the Memorial Sloan Cancer Center. Ed, what happened in arts, culture, and humanities?
Well, there is another good news story in this sector as well. In arts, culture, and humanities in 2015, the $17.07 billion represents an increase of 7% over 2014. And actually, when you look at the two-year increase from 2014 to 2012, that was 20% in current dollars. So good news in the arts, culture, and humanities sector. In fact, 5% of total donations went to the arts, culture, and humanities sector, and the total contributed reached its highest ever inflation-adjusted value in 2015. Now, there were some very large gifts to museums, major performing arts centers, and schools of art, which may have offset lower rates of growth to other types of arts, culture, humanities in 2015. For example, there was a $400 million gift in kind of pop art to the Chicago Art Institute by Stefan Edlis and Gail Neeson. You could even think about, in some respect, the $300 million estate gift to Princeton, which ended up going to the Princeton Firestone Library, being in a way an arts, culture, and humanities gift because the rare books and manuscripts included the Gutenberg Bible, a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, the first printed works of William Shakespeare. These are really treasures in the arts, culture, and humanities world. Overall, then, what we see is the arts and culture organizations are really seeing real growth. But on to foundations, which, Scott, you mentioned earlier was an interesting sector. Do you want to take us to that?
And we may not always think of the foundation community as a sector in the philanthropic world, but it's important to note that giving to foundations amounted to 11% of total giving in 2014, and contributions to foundations declined 3.8% over the previous year to $42.26 billion, but adjusted for inflation, that amount equaled 4%. It's often noted that cases where declines in foundation charitable giving can be attributed to the difference in large gifts received from year over year. Now, also, we want to highlight the fact that the estimate for giving to foundations includes gifts that are made to independent community and operating foundations. And the high watermark for foundations reached its highest point in 2014 at $44 billion. So this decline is in relationship to the high watermark of all-time giving to foundations. Also, we want to point out that several foundations received multiple $100 million gifts that amounted to nearly $800 million. So although there was no growth, and this might appear as a bit of an anomaly from 2014 to 2015, the type of growth that education and healthcare enjoyed, it's also important to point out that some of this was a reflection of the economy. Particularly hard hit were those foundations and corporate foundations that relied on the oil and gas sector, which saw the price of oil drop 50% over this period of time. I want to turn, because it's tied to this to some degree, to the role of philanthropy as it aligns with some key economic indicators. The first of which is gross domestic product. GDP, as you know, is defined as the market value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders within a specific period of time. It's one of the most important factors in measuring the status of a nation's economic health. GDP in the U.S., adjusted for inflation, grew by 3.3% between 2014 and 2015. Total giving as a percentage of GDP was 2.1% in 2015, 2014, and 2012. So what we're saying here is that GDP grew by 3.3%, and giving reflected 2.1% of GDP for the last 2 years, i.e. giving in relationship to GDP has been flat. I also want to point out, as you look at this chart, that giving is traditionally around 2% of GDP. Prior to 1975, it was consistently at or above that level. And then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it fell below 2%. But in the last 3 years, we were essentially around that same 2.1% number, which presents the question, if GDP has not grown and giving tracks with GDP, how did giving grow in fiscal 2015? So I want to switch to another chart of economic index, and that happens to be the link between giving and the Standard & Poor's 500 index. Research has found a statistically significant correlation between changes in giving and the values in the Standard & Poor's index. Because the stock market values are an indicator of financial and economic security, households, i.e. individuals, and corporations, as well as the foundations who invest in the market, are more likely to give when the stock market is up. Need to note as well that the direction of change and the robustness of growth in total giving generally lags slightly behind S&P. In other words, when the economy grows and the market grows, giving growth lags slightly behind that. As well, when the market turns down, a decline in giving lags behind that declination as well. Overall, inflation-adjusted growth for the year was 4%, even though the S&P declined 0.8% in inflation-adjusted dollars between 2014 and 2015. The overall growth in this marketplace between 2010 and the present, and the peace of mind that provides to people with affluence and wealth, is an indication of why so many $100 million plus gifts were recorded in this past year. Ed, what happens when we look at personal disposable income?
Sure. The theme of individual giving emerges again when we take a look at how individual giving related to disposable personal income, which of course represents the income that is available after taxes have been paid. In 2015, disposable income increased 3.7% in current dollars over 2014. Individual giving as a percentage of disposable income remained stable at 2% in 2015, and that was the same as last year, 2014, and 2012. Over the last 40 years, in fact, the high was 2.4% in the year 2000, and the low was 1.7% in 1997. So something to think about here, we all remember the concept of tithing, right? So give 10% to charities. Well, what we see here is that there's 8 points left to go, right? Because irrespective of the concept of tithing, individual giving has always been around 2% of disposable income, which raises that question again. We know the earlier data we showed that there was growth in total giving in 2015. And since the increase in giving was more than the increase in disposable income, 4.1% increase in total giving and 3.7% increase in disposable income, well then what drove that growth while giving as a percentage of disposable personal income was flat? Well, we thought about this quite a bit, and Scott will take you through some of our thoughts on that.
Well, as we step into this, I want to look again at the breakdown of giving by sources between the years 1976 and 2015. And at the Giving USA Institute, what's been done is this has been amalgamated in 5-year segments. The average rate of change in each one of these 5-year periods is 14.3% for the last 40 years. What's interesting to note as you look at the differential between the dark blue band at the top, which represents gifts from individuals, and the light blue band just below it, which represents gifts to foundations, what you're going to see is that that foundation band has increased over time. And of significance is the fact that this has primarily resulted in the growth of family foundations, beginning with the economic growth in the 1990s. It's continued into the present, and it's in fact been augmented by the growth of community foundations and the increased popularity of donor-advised funds that those community foundations may in fact manage. But when you take in combination individual giving at 71% of the total and bequests at 8% of the total, and the understanding that 47% of the gifts to foundations, roughly nearly half of that number, in aggregate, that still means that people influence giving about 85% of the total charitable financial support. And in the end, again, it's a reflection of the fact that people give to people in order to help other people. And Ed's going to help us take a look at this over time.
Absolutely. That notion of philanthropy, helping other people on an individual basis from individuals. So we'll take a look at giving by individuals. And in 2015, you see the number of $264.58 billion. That represents an increase of 3.8% from 2014 in real dollars and 3.7% adjusted for inflation, which is the same as the growth in personal disposable income. In fact, it's estimated that itemizers grew 4.1% and non-itemizers grew 2.5%. And what's underneath this growth that we see is that mega gifts by individuals were so prominent in 2015. In fact, the significance of the mega gifts is profound. We actually believe that the data shows a significant driver of the year-over-year increase in charitable giving in 2015 was the mega gift. And so thinking about that, we took a much closer look at that, and Scott's going to take us through some of the numbers there.
As a value add, Grunzenbach Lear & Associates tracks mega gifts as reported in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which happens to be the source of the data for this and the following charts. The impact of the mega gift on total growth of philanthropy is significant when you realize and recognize that following the recession in 2008 and 2009, these gifts effectively disappeared. And they started to return in 2013 and 14, and now they're extremely significant. Some of you may recall from campaign planning that we used to talk about the giving pyramid and the application of the 80-20 rule, and we turned that on its head and said it's actually 90% of the revenue that comes from 10% of those donors. And we looked at what resembled a very strong spiked Egyptian temple. That gift pyramid with which we were familiar in 2005 became a Mayan temple in 2009 with the top lopped off. The value proposition today is that top is back. The prevalence of these million-dollar gifts, primarily from individuals, ties into what Ed introduced on the previous slide. And I just want to point out here that we've actually tracked these. There were 22 gifts made in the past year at the $100 million plus level that in the aggregate totaled $3.33 billion with a B dollars. There were an additional 24 gifts that came in at the $50 million to $99 million level, and they in aggregate totaled $1.33 billion. And then at the bottom of our chart here, not the least in significance at all, were the $1 million to $49 million gifts in size, a total of which were 670. Those gifts represented $4.68 billion given in the last year. Now, these weren't just threshold gifts at the $1 million level. The average gift here was $6.89 million, which means there were several very significant $10 and $20, $25 million gifts that equated to the leadership gift level that many of our clients might see in their year-over-year work. Adding together, these gifts, these mega gifts, account for some $9 billion in total giving in 2015.
So you might ask, where did these $1 million gifts go? And of course, it's so important to understand the intent of the donor. So we see in the left bar here that colleges and universities received almost $6 billion of these $1 million gifts, representing almost 10% of giving to that sector. Moving over to the right, arts and culture received $910 million, about 6% of the giving to the sector. And then over to the furthest right, healthcare received $710 million, around 2% of giving to the sector. But of course, please recall that this healthcare is a IRS designation, and notably gifts to academic medicine are captured here in the colleges and universities line. So what's the takeaway of all this? Well, at GG+A, we see time and again that on our work with our clients, large gifts have a supply component and a demand component, supply and demand. And by the supply side, what we mean is that the institution needs to supply the marketplace with the big ideas that are worthy of support at significant levels. Time and again, we see that the big gifts come from the big ideas. And on the demand side, well, of course, this is the donor side that we all work so hard on. And to manage the demand side, institutional fundraisers need a depth of relationship with these donors in order to be having the conversations about these big ideas. So if you want to think about how you and your institution can participate in this northward growth in giving, a key takeaway we might suggest is that if you want to focus on growth, you may want to reconsider redoubling your efforts on both the supply and the demand side. Big gifts come from big ideas, so ask yourself, what's our inventory of big ideas? What are the big ideas we are bringing to the marketplace? And on the demand side, how are our relationships with our closest donors, with whom we have our deepest relationships? Do we have enough of them? Are we close? How can we bring them closer? When you go to the mega gifts of $100 million to look at the sectors, you see these 22 gifts that Scott mentioned. And of these gifts of $100 million or more, here are the different sectors and disciplinary areas which receive the gifts. Now, notably, 16 of the 22 gifts went to colleges and universities, and of those, 4 went to arts and sciences, 4 to business, and 4 to engineering. We noted earlier the John Paulson gift of $400 million to Harvard to endow and name that School of Engineering. When you look at the mega gifts of $100 million or more by purpose, here you see them listed, and the top 2 purposes are founding gifts and naming gifts, pointing again to the importance of the big ideas and the relationships with donors who wish to bring those ideas to fruition through their philanthropy. You know, it all ties back to what Scott said at the beginning. Once again, in philanthropy, we see giving as a means of people helping people. And the 2015 growth in philanthropy happens to be driven by giving by individuals as a means of achieving this, with a particular focus at the mega gift level.
So what's our key takeaway from this conversation? First, we note that the increase in charitable giving of $14.65 billion represented the change between 2015 and 2014. We also noted that personal disposable income did not change, and gross domestic product did not change. And philanthropy is tied to those two numbers. Yet the increase grew by an incredible $14.65 billion. So in response to our earlier question, what drove that growth? Well, as we've stated, it was largely fueled by gifts of $1 million or more. And when you add those three sections together, they represent 63.75% of the total increase. If you break it down, the gifts of $100 million or more represented 23% of the total increase. Gifts at the $50 million level represented 31% of that increase. And in aggregate, all those gifts that we tracked represented 63.75% of the total increase year over year, 2014 to 2015. So this once again just reinforces the dramatic gesture that philanthropy demonstrates. And as we've been saying, the notion that people give to people to help other people is connoted in the actual term itself: philos, love, anthropos, humanity, the love of humankind. And that's what we're seeing reflected this year in a big way, as reported in the Giving USA statistics.
Thanks, Scott, and we want to thank each of you for attending and joining. We've enjoyed bringing this material to you, and we look forward to another great year in philanthropy ahead.